The Independent Electoral Commission will tomorrow hold interviews for the 12 candidates shortlisted for position of commissioner. It's as Glen Mashinini's term comes to an end on the 16th of April. Among the shortlisted candidates are Justice Bekebeke, Nalini Maharaj, Gladwyn and Dr. Sithembile Mbete. We're joined by Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute Director of Programs, Ebrahim Fakir, and former IEC chairperson, Justice Johann Kriegler. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for your time tonight. Firstly, Justice Kriegler, let me begin with you. Undertaking a process of this nature, we're going to be having some of the heads of the other Chapter 9 institutions be part of the interview process. I mean, how significant is it for the IEC and, you know, almost directly for the country as well?
Kathy, good evening to you. Good evening to the viewers. You know, the public notices have been a little misleading. The position that is being filled now is not that of the chair of the Electoral Commission. It's of a member. There are 5 members. Glen Mashinini's term of office expires next month, and the replacement is just a commissioner. It is not the chair that is to be filled. That is an appointment that the president will make in due course once there are 5 commissioners again. The significance of the appointment process is to show that the Electoral Commission is totally independent of government. It is selected by the representatives of Chapter 9 institutions who put together the first broad list. That goes to a multi-party committee, and Parliament ultimately recommends one name to the President, and he appoints that person.
Ebrahim, when it comes to, you know, the shortlisted candidates for this position of commissioner, of course, these commissioners play a significant role in the work of the IEC, and often the president looks at them when deciding who should be the chair.
Well, absolutely he must, as he should, because the real requirement here is to ensure that the person has sufficient credibility, but also, quite importantly, legitimacy and respect from especially amongst the political parties, but most importantly from the public. Because the reality is that the commissioners don't play an operational role. They play a policy making and an oversight role, important as it is, as the oversight role is, and the policy making role. But the policy making role is often done in consultation and conjunction with the top officials of the IEC. Now, in that regard, Kathy, I think the appointment is going to be a vital one, because this is the first time the Electoral Commission has come to the public in which the credibility ratings are in fact quite low. Until about 2 or 3 years ago, most public perception surveys would show you that the IEC was one of those institutions in the public sphere which enjoyed very high levels of credibility, close to 2/3 of adult South Africans. In this last election, 2021 local election, a lot of it was eroded, and it's the first time in which the credibility rating was in fact quite low. Part of this is due to the kind of assault which has been made on the Commission, sometimes quite spurious without justification, particularly by political parties.
Ebrahim, you know, you bring me straight into, the next point I was going to get to you about, and it's really about the kind of climate that we're operating under, especially politically. Just in this last local government elections, we really saw the way in which the IEC as an institution, and even some of the commissioners at the IEC, were seemingly the line of target for politicians. Does that mean that the interview process that is now going to be undertaken will be met with the same level of scrutiny as perhaps what we have seen in other public interview processes like the JSC, and, you know, the list is really endless?
It shouldn't be. Justice Kriegler?
Go ahead, you go ahead.
I mean, you know, the reality is that this is despite the openness of the process, despite the fact that there's a public nomination process, the first cut of interviews are done by the heads of Chapter 9 institutions in the Office of the Chief Justice. Ultimately, it does go to Parliament, it goes to a portfolio committee before it goes to a plenary, and then a recommendation. So there is some kind of politics involved. To the extent that we often thought the Judicial Services Commission was often beyond reproach, that there would be no political interference, so on. The reality of the matter is that once you had political party representatives on it, it, at least in recent times, became more and more politicized. And my fear is that the IEC is the last bastion of institutions which have remained immune thus far from what I call malevolent capture. And I think the time is right. I think the time is ripe also where political parties may make a ploy in order to get their person in so that they can manipulate this institution in the way that they did others. And that will be incredibly tragic. Because across the continent, once the election result is called into question and there are major problems which emerge from it, the conflict is almost intractable.
Justice Kriegler?
Yes, I agree entirely. It is particularly when the competition gets really tight. And that is why what was different about the local government elections. It's because the ANC no longer controls the electorate with a firm hand, when it is now being endangered by other parties, when the competition gets keen, when the races are close, when the tension is high, that the referee, the umpire, the electoral commission is brought into the crossfire between the political parties. And it's a natural tendency for political competitors to blame the process if they lose. In fact, it's the natural reaction of all competitors and all competitions. And in politics, the stakes are immensely high. Politics where you are voting for national office are incredibly high, and it's because the stakes are so high that when the races are close, the tendency to attack the adjudicating body is at its strongest. Therefore, at this stage, the Electoral Commission and each of its members should be scrutinized closely by the public to ensure that they are people in whose integrity and in whose competence and in whose supervisory competence we have confidence.
Ebrahim, often the political mudslinging that both you and Justice Kriegler are talking about here results in a blurring of the lines and causes great confusion, especially to ordinary members of the public who are really trying to just discern what the truth is in any situation. And so going into this interview processes, as we watch things unfold, what would you want us to keep in mind so that we almost are prepared for whatever may lie ahead?
Well, the first thing we must keep in mind is that the IEC and the Electoral Commission does not, in fact, make major political decisions. I was actually, frankly, shocked, not surprised, shocked, rudely shocked, when the Constitutional Court that ruled that the political parties in Parliament must devise a new electoral system. At the first Portfolio Committee meeting, you had MPs asking the IEC to come with proposals. That is not what the Constitutional Court asked. Previously, in elections, you would have complaints made against the IEC that they don't provide enough broadcast time, that we don't have equitable access to the airways. That's not the IEC's problem. That's ICASA's issue, particularly with regard to the public broadcaster. The same is true with regard to the funding environment. Before, of course, now we've got the regulation of private funding of parties over, 100,000. There's talk of wanting to amend that. But previously, there was no such regulation. The accusation was made that the IEC does this. Now, let's be clear. The IEC is an election manager. the IEC is an election administrator. That is, of course, quite a powerful and influential role, but we must be very careful that there is a separation also in the role between the commissioners and the operational staff of the IEC. They take care of all the logistics, all the supply chains, all of the balloting materials, making sure that the things are printed and so on. Bear in mind, Kathy, that we are facing the prospect of a new electoral system. Of course, we don't know what shape it's going to take once Parliament finally decides on this. But ultimately, there's going to be new administrative arrangements, routines, and process requirements which are in place. But on the question of politics and mediating political parties, the IEC has fairly robust mechanisms, particularly oversight, facilitation, conflict reduction mechanisms, most of it built into law. It's the fact that the political parties don't respect the process, the electoral code of conduct, the multi-party liaison committees, and even though they are party to decisions made at the multi-party liaison committees, they will turn around and say, oh, sorry, we didn't agree to this, and so on. Look, it's true that there are certain administrative, logistical problems which have emerged in the IEC, but those can be corrected. The real problems are political.
Justice Kriegler, let me finish off with you and then perhaps ask you, what do you think are going to be some of the key questions that need to be put to these shortlisted candidates?
I'm not a firm believer in an interview process to discover hidden talents in people. I think you must examine their track record, but the interviewing bodies must know precisely who they have before them. They must establish whether there are any skeletons in the cupboard, whether there are any achievements in the past, and above all, they must look for people of integrity and courage, and people in whom the general public can have or already have confidence. The nature of the questions must depend upon the particular background of the candidate. I don't think you can ever prescribe a particular set of questions. But the job is basically to have a good look at the candidates, to decide for yourself as an interviewer whether this is the kind of person whom you would trust to be part of the adjudicatory body in the next national election.